The entire mall stood still as a loud commotion echoed through the gleaming marble hallways. Shoppers froze mid-step, their conversations silenced by the sight unfolding in front of the upscale clothing store near the atrium. The mall manager, a stern-looking man with slicked-back hair named Mr. Graham, was towering over an old man in ragged clothes. His face was twisted in anger, and his voice boomed. "I told you, old man. We don't tolerate vagrants hanging around here," Mr. Graham bellowed, pointing aggressively toward the exit. "Get out of my mall, now!" The elderly man, with a scruffy grey beard and a tattered coat that barely shielded him from the cold, stood his ground. Despite his humble appearance, there was a quiet dignity in the way he held himself. The wrinkles on his face hinted at years of wisdom and experience, but none of that seemed to matter to Mr. Graham. "I'm just waiting for someone," the old man said calmly, though his voice trembled with a mix of frustration and humiliation. "Yeah, right," Mr. Graham sneered. "Waiting to beg for money. More like it. Not on my watch." A small crowd had gathered, whispering and exchanging glances. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others shook their heads in agreement with Mr. Graham. Among the spectators was a man in a tailored navy blue suit, standing quietly near a pillar. His sharp eyes watched the scene intently, and his expression grew darker with each passing second. Nobody knew who he was. Yet, Mr. Graham didn't seem to care about the attention he was drawing. Emboldened by the murmurs of support from some onlookers, he grabbed the old man by the arm. Clearly intending to drag him out of the mall, the elderly man winced but didn't fight back. "That's enough." A deep, commanding voice cut through the air, stopping everyone in their tracks. Mr. Graham froze, his grip loosening as he turned toward the source of the voice. The man in the navy blue suit stepped forward, his face set like stone. The crowd parted as he made his way toward the manager and the elderly man. "Who are you?" Mr. Graham demanded, though his voice faltered slightly. The man's eyes flashed with fury. "I'm the owner of this mall," gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Mr. Graham's face turned pale. The old man looked surprised too, though he said nothing. The owner's gaze never wavered. "And I just watched you humiliate and manhandle this gentleman in front of everyone." His voice was calm, but there was a razor-sharp edge to it. "You have some explaining to do, Mr. Graham." The tension in the air was palpable. No one dared to speak. The mall owner's words hung in the air, like a storm cloud, ready to unleash chaos. It had started like any other Saturday morning. The mall bustled with activity as families, teenagers, and shoppers roamed the expansive space filled with designer stores, food stalls, and entertainment corners. Mr. Graham prided himself on running a tight ship. Everything had to be immaculate, from the polished floors to the perfectly aligned displays in the storefronts. He had earned a reputation for being strict but effective. Under his management, the mall had flourished, but his no-nonsense attitude often crossed the line into arrogance. He had little patience for anything that disrupted the pristine image he worked so hard to maintain. That morning, he had been in his office reviewing sales reports when one of the security guards called. "Sir, there's an old man loitering near the central atrium," the guard reported. "Looks like a tramp." Mr. Graham frowned. "Handle it," he said dismissively. "He's not causing trouble," the guard added hesitantly. "Just sitting there." Mr. Graham slammed the report down on his desk. "Do I have to do everything myself?" he muttered before storming out of his office. As he made his way to the atrium, his sharp eyes scanned the crowd. The sight of the elderly man sitting on a bench near the upscale boutique immediately set his teeth on edge. The man's coat was frayed, his shoes scuffed, and his hands weathered from years of hard work or hardship. It didn't matter which to Mr. Graham. To him, the man was an eyesore. He marched up to the bench, his voice already rising. "Hey, you," he barked. "You can't sit here." The old man looked up, his expression calm but weary. "Why not?" he asked simply. Mr. Graham scoffed. "Because this is private property, and I don't want people like you scaring off paying customers." A few shoppers glanced their way, but quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. "I'm waiting for someone," the old man said, his voice steady. Mr. Graham narrowed his eyes. "I don't care. Leave, or I'll have security escort you out." The old man sighed and stood up, but before he could take a step, Mr. Graham grabbed his arm. That was the moment everything spiraled out of control. People started gathering, drawn by the escalating confrontation. Mr. Graham's voice grew louder, and his grip on the old man tightened. The elderly man winced but didn't resist, and that was when the owner of the mall, who had been observing from a distance, decided he had seen enough. As the confrontation reached its peak, the owner's booming voice cut through the chaos, commanding attention. The crowd fell silent. Mr. Graham, who had been so confident moments ago, now looked like a deer caught in headlights. The mall owner's words had shifted the entire atmosphere. The spectators waited with bated breath, wondering what would happen next. And Mr. Graham knew, deep down, that his world was about to come crashing down. A tense silence hung in the air as Mr. Graham struggled to compose himself. The crowd's curious eyes bored into him, and sweat beaded on his forehead. The mall owner, a commanding figure with piercing eyes, took a deliberate step closer. "Do you care to explain your behavior?" the owner demanded, his voice dangerously calm. Mr. Graham cleared his throat, attempting to regain his usual authority. "Sir, I was just doing my job," he said defensively. "This man was loitering, and I have a responsibility to maintain the mall's image." The owner's expression hardened. "Is that what you call it? Harassing and humiliating an innocent man in front of shoppers?" Mr. Graham faltered. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," he stammered. "But he looked like trouble." The old man, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "I was just waiting for my granddaughter," he said quietly. "She's meeting me here for lunch." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people cast sympathetic glances at the old man, while others shot disapproving looks at Mr. Graham. The owner's gaze never wavered. "So, your justification for your behavior is that this gentleman didn't fit your narrow definition of a proper customer?" he asked coldly. Mr. Graham opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. The owner took a deep breath, as though reining in his anger. "What's your name, sir?" he asked, turning to the elderly man. "Thomas," the old man replied. "Thomas Harris." The owner's eyes softened. "Mr. Harris, I'm deeply sorry for what you've been put through today," he said sincerely. "This is not how we treat our guests." Mr. Harris gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said simply. The owner turned back to Mr. Graham, his expression once again steely. "As for you," he said, "we'll be having a very serious conversation in my office. Effective immediately. You are suspended." Gasps erupted from the crowd. Mr. Graham's face turned ashen. "But, sir," he sputtered. The owner held up a hand. "No excuse. Yes. Meet me in my office now." Defeated, Mr. Graham slinked away. His shoulders slumped. The crowd began to disperse. Their curiosity satisfied, the owner turned back to Mr. Harris. "Can I walk you to the food court while you wait for your granddaughter?" he offered. Mr. Harris smiled faintly. "That would be nice," he said. As they walked away, the tension in the air dissipated, replaced by a sense of justice served. But just when it seemed the drama had come to a close, a sudden shout echoed through the mall. "Help! Someone's trying to take my bag!" The mall owner and Mr. Harris both stopped in their tracks, their heads snapping toward the commotion. A young woman was struggling to hold onto her purse as a masked man yanked it violently. The mall erupted into chaos once again. And the owner knew this was far from over. The mall's chaotic echoes ricocheted through the wide hallways as the masked man made a desperate dash toward the exit, clutching the stolen purse. Shoppers scattered, some ducking into stores while others whipped out their phones to record the unfolding mayhem. Security guards were already sprinting after the thief, but he was fast, weaving between kiosks and darting around startled customers. The mall owner, still beside Mr. Harris, clenched his jaw. "Stay here," he instructed firmly before breaking into a run. Despite his tailored suit, he moved with surprising agility, determined not to let the thief escape. Mr. Harris watched in awe. "That man is full of surprises," he muttered to himself. Near the entrance, a young child wandered too close to the thief's path. The boy's mother screamed, her face contorted with terror. Without missing a beat, the mall owner lunged forward and yanked the boy out of harm's way, sending them both tumbling to the floor. The thief hesitated for a split second, his path now clear, before continuing his mad dash toward the doors. "Stop him!" someone shouted. A burly security guard tackled the thief just as he reached the glass entrance. The purse flew from his rip, skidding across the floor. Panting and struggling, the thief kicked wildly, but the guard pinned him down. The crowd erupted into cheers as the guard secured the thief's hands behind his back. The mall owner, disheveled but unharmed, stood up and dusted himself off. The mother of the child he had saved rushed over, tears streaming down her face. Thank you," she sobbed, clutching her son tightly. "It's okay," the owner said, his voice gentle. "He's safe now." By the time the commotion settled, the thief had been escorted away by security. Shoppers began to return to their business, though the buzz of excitement lingered in the air. The mall owner retrieved the purse and walked back to the young woman who had been the target of the theft. Her face was pale, and she was visibly shaken. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "Thank you so much," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't helped." He gave her a reassuring nod. "I'm just glad you're okay." As he walked back toward Mr. Harris, he noticed Mr. Graham lingering near the edge of the scene, his expression dark and brooding. The sight made the owner's blood boil again. "Mr. Graham?" the owner said sharply. The suspended manager stiffened. "Yes, sir?" "Follow me to my office," the owner commanded. His tone left no room for argument. Mr. Graham's lips thinned, but he obediently followed. The office was spacious and meticulously decorated, with sleek furniture and large windows that offered a panoramic view of the mall. The mall owner took a seat behind his polished mahogany desk, gesturing for Mr. Graham to sit. "I'll get straight to the point," the owner said, his voice cold. "Your actions earlier today were unacceptable. You humiliated and physically accosted a guest without just cause." Mr. Graham's jaw tightened. "I was only trying to maintain the mall's image," he argued. "We can't have vagrants wandering around scaring off customers." The owner's eyes blazed with fury. "Mr. Harris is not a vagrant. He's a paying guest. And even if he weren't, that would never justify your behavior." Mr. Graham opened his mouth to respond, but the owner cut him off. "And do you realize who Mr. Harris is?" Confusion flickered across Mr. Graham's face. "What do you mean?" The owner leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. "Mr. Harris is not just some random old man. He's one of the original investors in this mall. Without him, this place wouldn't even exist." Shock washed over Mr. Graham's face. I had no idea," he stammered. "Of course you didn't," the owner said coldly. "Because you judged him solely on his appearance." Mr. Graham's shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "Sorry isn't enough," the owner said sternly. "Effective immediately. You are fired." The finality of those words hit Mr. Graham like a punch to the gut. He slumped in his chair, his face ashen. "Please, sir, give me another chance," he begged. "I've been with this mall for years. I made a mistake, but I'll do better." The owner's expression softened slightly. "You've had years to do better, Mr. Graham. Today was the last straw." Defeated, Mr. Graham rose from his seat. "I understand," he said quietly. As he walked toward the door, the owner called after him. "One more thing." Mr. Graham turned, his eyes filled with despair. "Learn from this," the owner said. "Treat people with dignity, no matter how they look." Mr. Graham nodded silently before leaving the office. Later that afternoon, the mall owner found Mr. Harris sitting in the food court with his granddaughter, a lively young woman with curly brown hair. They were laughing over milkshakes, the tension of the morning seemingly forgotten. The owner approached their table. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course not," Mr. Harris said warmly. "Thank you for everything today." The owner's smile. "I'm just sorry it happened in the first place." Mr. Harris waved a hand dismissively. "It's water under the bridge, but I must say, you handle yourself pretty well for a businessman." The owner chuckled. "I have to stay sharp in this line of work." As they chatted, the granddaughter looked at the owner with curiosity. "You're the mall owner, right?" she asked. "That's right," he confirmed. "Well," she said with a grin, "you're definitely cooler than I expected." Mr. Harris laughed. "See? Even the young ones approve." The owner smiled, feeling a sense of peace. The mall had seen its share of drama that day, but justice had been served, and dignity restored. And sometimes that was enough. As the mall fell into chaos, the owner's instincts kicked in. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the scene, weaving through panicked shoppers. Security guards were closing in from different angles, but the thief was desperate, thrashing wildly and pushing anyone in his way. Mr. Harris stood at a distance, watching with concern as the mall's security team converged on the masked figure. His keen eyes, despite his age, caught every movement as if the years hadn't dulled his awareness. The mall owner lunged forward just as the thief slipped past two guards. He tackled the man to the ground with a force that sent both of them skidding across the polished floor. Gasps echoed around the mall as people froze in shock. The thief's mask slipped off, revealing a gaunt, wide-eyed young man who looked more scared than menacing. "You're not going anywhere," the owner growled, holding him down until the guards cuffed him. As the thief was dragged away, the crowd erupted in cheers, their fear turning to relief. The young woman who had nearly lost her purse was trembling but unharmed. The mall owner dusted himself off and helped her to her feet. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, her voice shaky. "Thank you. You saved me." As calm slowly returned to the mall, the owner turned back to Mr. Harris, who was watching with a knowing smile. "You've still got some fight in you," Mr. Harris said with a chuckle. The owner smiled wryly. "Some things are worth fighting for." And in that moment, the weight of the day lifted. What had started as a moment of injustice had become a lesson in courage, dignity, and redemption. A story neither the mall nor its people would forget anytime soon.